British General Strike, 1926, by Tom Brown. Originally published in War Commentary, November-December 1942. Storm clouds. In the spring of 1925, storm clouds gathered over the British coalfields. The coming struggle was the chief conversational topic in the grim mining villages. Germany was re-entering the international trade war as a competitor of Britain. The German miners' wages had been slashed, the industry rationalized by the aid of Anglo-American capital investment, German currency stabilized by the Dawes Plan. Already faced by this keen competitor, the British coal export trade was embarrassed by the government's return to the gold standard. It was soon obvious that the mine owners would meet the new international situation by cutting wages, and on June 30th, 1925, they served notice to terminate the national agreement, proposing ending the minimum wage, heavy wage cuts, and district instead of national agreements. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain replied by putting their case before the Trades Union Congress General Council at a joint meeting on July 10th. The General Council pledged the trade unions full support of the miners, and setting up a special committee, met the executives of all the railway and transport unions, who agreed upon an embargo on moving coal. The unions quickly acted by issuing official instructions to all railway and transport workers. Quote, "Wagons containing coal must not be attached to any train after midnight on Friday, July 31st, and after this time wagons of coal must not be supplied to any industrial or commercial concerns, coal exports. All tippers and trimmers will cease work at the end of the second shift on July 31st, coal imports. On no account may import coal be handled from July 31st. All men engaged in delivering coal to commercial and industrial concerns will cease Friday night, July 31st. Unquote. A specially summoned conference of trade union executive committees gave unanimous support to the instructions. Unprepared for such resistance, the cabinet, which had fiercely backed the coal owners, hastily met, and the Prime Minister, Baldwin, summoned the leaders of miners and owners to Downing Street. On the morning of Friday, July 31st, the government announced the granting of a subsidy to the coal industry, amounting to £25 million and extending over 9 months. The wage cuts and other demands of the owners were postponed until April 1926. July 31st, 1925 became known as Red Friday. It was obvious to all that the 9 months' grace was merely a time of preparation for the ruling class, and this thought was expressed in the report of the Special Committee of the TUC. It felt that its task had not been completed, and with the consent of the General Council proposed to remain in being, and to apply itself to the task of devising ways and means of consolidating the resistance of the trade union movement, should the attack be renewed. Alas, little if any preparation for the inevitable struggle was made by the TUC or the affiliated unions. Not so the government. Speaking of Red Friday, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, "We therefore decided to postpone the crisis, in the hope of averting it, or if not averting it, of coping effectually with it when the time comes." A strike-breaking organization known as OMS, Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies, was created. Blacklegs were trained to drive locomotives in the private railways of large factories at weekends, and potential scabs instructed in the operations of telephones and telegraphy. The country was placed on a war footing by dividing it into 10 areas, each under a civil commissioner, and a civil service organization was set up in each of these areas. Great numbers of special constables were enrolled and mobile squads of police organized. Every possible preparation was made, and the commissioners and their officers stood ready for the signal. In the meantime, a royal commission on the coal industry, presided over by Sir Herbert Samuel, presented its report. The report was vague and woolly on the subject of reorganization of the industry, but very definite in demanding wage reductions and lengthening of the working day. On the 1st of May. As the renewal of the battle became more certain, the miners rallied around the slogan, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day, no district agreements," and behind the leadership of the indefatigable A.J. Cook, attempted to arouse the labour movement. In April, the coal owners announced that unless the miners accepted the employers' demands, a lockout would take place on May 1st. On April 20th, King George V proclaimed a state of emergency, and the Special Constabulary were mobilised. Hyde Park became a military camp. Troops in full war kit paraded the streets, and tanks and armoured cars rumbled into Newcastle, Liverpool, Birmingham, and all industrial cities. Warships were sent up the Thames, the Tyne, the Humber, and the Clyde. The executives of the trade unions were called to a conference of the TUC on April 29th. The conference continued to sit during the following day, Friday, while the TUC leaders trotted to and fro between the conference hall and Downing Street, begging Baldwin to find a way out. Said J. H. Thomas, "I suppose my usual critics will say that Thomas was almost grovelling, and it is true. I never begged and pleaded like I begged and pleaded all today." Saturday, May 1st, 1926, May Day, 1 million miners were locked out. The TUC conference assembled at forenoon in the Memorial Hall, Farringdon Street, and received the general strike memorandum of the General Council. A tense pause and the roll call began, union by union. For once in a score of years, a trade union conference expressed the mood of the workers. For the general strike, 3,653,527. Against, 49,911. Unable to reply in time, 318,000. The executive rose and sang the red flag and left the gloomy old hall for the sunshine of the streets, to mingle with the greatest May Day demonstration London had ever seen. Strange though it seems, the TUC leaders immediately resumed their begging perambulations to Downing Street. While still trying to avert the strike, they were suddenly horrified to learn the fight had already started. Late on Sunday night, May 2nd, the leaders of the Miners' Federation and the TUC were meeting the full cabinet at Downing Street when the news of the first skirmish reached them. The Daily Mail was about to appear with a particularly vicious anti-strike article. The type had already been set and moulded, the machines set up and the proof copies run off. When the machinists read the bitter words of editorial hatred of the workers, the machines stopped. The Nat Sopa Chapel met and quickly decided to tell the management to delete the leader if they wanted their paper. All other departments met and decided to back the machine room. Monday, May 3rd, and no Daily Mail appeared. When Baldwin heard the news, he jumped up from the table and ended the negotiations. The TUC leaders still grovelled to avoid the fight, said one of the most prominent grovellers. With other union leaders, I sought an interview with the Prime Minister and his colleagues in a last-minute attempt to show that the compositors' strike was isolated and unofficial, without our approval, and to plead, almost on our knees, for a less cruel arbitration than he was forcing upon us, an open fight between the workers and the Cabinet. But the Cabinet had left number 10, and the place was deserted, save by a single sleepy attendant. Memoirs, J.R. Clines. Think of it, a general repudiating his soldiers on the eve of battle and condemning them for being ready to fight. In the House of Commons the grovelling went on, but the government knew the cowardice of the Labour leaders and refused to allow them a way out. Baldwin knew the TUC and Labour Party leaders hated and feared the general strike. He, Baldwin, turned on us and quoted an article written some time before Ramsay MacDonald in the New Leader. All my life I have been opposed to the sympathetic strike. It has no practical value. It has one certain result, a blinding reaction. Liberty is far more easily destroyed by those who abuse it than by those who oppose it. I agree with every word of that, commented Baldwin in a hushed and crowded house. Memoirs, J.R. Clines. So Baldwin led the employers to battle with an ILP text inscribed on their banners. Midnight, Monday, May 3rd, 1926. The general strike was on. Lions led by rats. Britain awoke on the morning of Tuesday, May 4th, to find the general strike in being. The railways were still and silent, buses and trams had disappeared, no newspaper was on sale. Unfortunately, the strike was not really general. Instead, the TUC wished it to be known as the National Strike instead of the old syndicalist name. The General Council, apparently on the initiative of Bevan, decided to divide the workers' forces into two sections, front line and reserves. The front line, composed of printing trades, railmen, busmen, tramwaymen, and other road transport workers and dockers, were called out from midnight May 3rd. The reserve line of engineering and shipyard workers, iron and steel and chemical workers, the textile industry and building trade were not called out until the last day of the strike, after it had been called off. This division of the workers' forces is a particularly stupid example of the attempted application of military rules to a social conflict. The result of the division was to isolate the strikers in certain towns where they formed a minority. Let us consider the example of Coventry, a very compact town devoted entirely to engineering. Such a town does not depend on road transport proportionately as much as London does. Nor is Coventry a railway centre. So in Coventry the strike was limited to railmen, a small body of busmen, and a few printers. The case of Coventry was repeated in hundreds of other towns given over to engineering, textiles, and chemicals. The strikers were to be small bodies of trade unionists, separated from the mass of their fellows. Fortunately, the workers thought differently. Again, we shall take the example of Coventry as being typical of the whole country. The workers of the Armstrong Whitworth Aircraft Company trudged gloomily from Coventry to the aerodrome in Whitley Common. Arriving there, they found the hangars surrounded by the military. The first arrivals refused to enter while the place was under military control, and when their numbers increased, a decision to join the strike was made. Returning to Coventry, the strikers besieged the district offices of the Amalgamated Engineering Union and sent small parties to the auto factories to inform their fellow engineers. The aircraft workers successfully demanded a district aggregate meeting of the AEU. Members and the meeting decided to close the engineering shops of the city on May 6th. Much the same was happening in many parts of the country. The workers were making the strike general. Nor were the workers content to spread the strike. They had to make it effective. Immediately they turned their attention to transport picketing. The stoppage of road and rail transport was almost complete the first day. In London, only 40 of the 5,000 buses ran. In most towns, no attempt was made to run tram or bus services throughout the strike. But quickly, the student and middle-class blacklegs appeared on the roads, mainly to drive lorries. Class against class. The almost instinctive strategy of the masses was superior to that of their self-esteemed leaders. The workers knew that a modern state depends on centralization and concentration of power, and that centralized power could be effective only by the use of intricate communications, electric power, telephones and telegraphy, railways and road transport. So the strikers and unemployed formed themselves into a mass road and rail pickets. The road pickets were particularly effective in the mining areas, for the miners did not need to picket their blackleg-proof pits. No student ever went down a mine to scab on a miner. They preferred sitting in the driver's seat of a car with a big policeman each side to stop the bricks. A glance at the map will remind us that the chief communications arteries of England run north to south and near the border are narrowed down by the waste of Britain and the Pennine chain, so that the two slim sets of railways and roads skirt the east and west coast. One of these, the east, runs through the Northumberland and Durham coalfields, and there took place the most effective picketing of the strike. Throughout the country, buses and lorries were overturned, and often petrol bowsers were fired. In some towns, huge car parks were formed of the Blacklegs' vehicles, and their drivers were often taken prisoner. On the railways, a scattered warfare was carried on, and the BBC and press reported damage to points, blackleg plate layers running for their lives, telegraph wires cut, and signal boxes successfully attacked. The Flying Scotsman Express was derailed by miners at Cramlington, Northumberland. The BBC gave a stirring account of the workers' attack on the Central Railway station at Middlesbrough. At 9 p.m. on Thursday, May 6th, the workers stopped a train at a main live crossing in the middle of the town, and then, in one spirited charge, captured the station and blocked the line with heavy wagons. We must not suppose that the General Council had the slightest sympathy with such robust action. At the beginning, they had urged the workers to stay at home or play games. They even suggested that the workers play football with the police. The miners had an idea how a football match with the police should be run. Such ideas are not approved by the Football Association. Revolutionary beginnings. The mass pickets gave enormous strength to the transport permit committees. These committees had been formed when the government refused the TUC offer to carry on food transport along with the health services. The purpose of the committees was to check the claims of and grant permits to those wishing to transport food or other essentials. In most localities, employers ignored the government transport committees and humbly presented their claims to the strikers' permit committees. In Northumberland and Durham, the OMS broke down and the government regional commissioner at Newcastle pleaded to the Joint Strike Committee to join him in dual control of the food distribution. The attack on other forms of communication was gravely hindered by the timidity of the General Council. Post office, telephone, and telegraph workers were never called out. The position of the electricity supply workers was very obscure. The General Council talked of cutting off power but maintaining light. In most cases, the electrical workers settled the problem by coming out. While the workers struck at the communications of the enemy, they at the same time organized their own. Thousands of cars and motorcycles, tens of thousands of cycles stood ready at strike headquarters or sped along the roads, the black and yellow TUC label clearing the road before them. The strike was organized in each town by a hastily formed council of action. In some cases, these councils were just old trade union councils or their executive committees. In other cases, entirely new councils were formed by delegates or officials from district councils of the chief unions. In Northumberland and Durham, the local councils of action were federated into a regional council, covering the important industrial area of the northeast, controlling the two coalfields and the ports and shipyards of Tyne, Tees and Weir, with the great engineering and chemical works and the north-south traffic routes. The councils suffered a great deal from lack of daily contact with the masses of strikers, and most of the stirring and really effective actions were unorganized and spontaneous. The government's chief weapons were a display of military force, police terrorism, and heavy propaganda. Attempts to run the economy of the country were secondary to these. No newspapers appeared, though most newspaper offices published a few duplicated bulletins, until the government issued the British Gazette. Churchill was the chief editor. The paper was published at a great loss. In Durham it was distributed by dropping copies from aircraft, a method reminiscent of war. In most localities, copies were slipped into the letterboxes of working-class homes at night. The BBC, however, was the government's chief propaganda weapon. The TUC could have overcome any effects of the BBC by holding 1,000 or so meetings every day. Those were the days of open-air Labour propaganda, and crowds would quickly have assembled. Instead, the General Council discouraged meetings. In common with any principal colleagues, I have avoided speech-making and advised against mass meetings of strikers or sympathizers, Memoirs Klein's. Printed propaganda for the strike had been prohibited by the TUC ban on all printing, even the TUC's own Daily Herald coming under the ban. Local strike committees got around the ban by issuing cyclo-style bulletins. After a few days, the General Council issued the British Worker, in reply to Churchill's British Gazette. In the House of Commons, Sir John Simon, speaking as a lawyer, declared the general strike to be illegal. Much has been made of this since, but at the time it did not have the slightest effect on the strikers. The government did not limit itself to propaganda. In the Clyde, the Hood, then the world's largest battleship, the Warspite, and the Comus threatened the working-class quarters with their guns. Destroyers lay in the harbours of Harwich, Cardiff, Portsmouth, and Middlesbrough. The London power stations were manned by naval engine room ratings, and naval men worked the London docks. A submarine supplied electric power to the port of London. The London docks were besieged by striking dockers, and middle-class blacklegs were afraid to go there. The docks were heavily guarded by soldiers in full war kit, and machine guns were mounted everywhere. The Home Secretary met high army and naval officers. "Make your plans," he said. "Use whatever force you require. I give you carte blanche, but my orders are that the London docks must be opened at all costs." Warships took loads of the blacklegs down the Thames at night, and 100 food lorries were loaded. Next morning the lorries passed through the East End in convoy, guarded by hundreds of police, 2 battalions of infantry with fixed bayonets, a number of tanks, and 10 armoured cars. Every day the strike became more clearly a struggle between two classes, a fight between the workers and the state. The struggle itself created that clear picture. It was not a result of propaganda, as the labour leaders wailed. The whole crux of the struggle had been skillfully shifted by propaganda from a sympathetic protest at the unfair treatment of the miners to a constitutional struggle between Parliament and anarchism. Memoirs Kleins. Betrayed. As the strike developed, more workers joined it. The picket lines increased, the tourniquet on the high roads tightened. There was never any slackening of the strike. According to Professor W. H. Crook, The General Strike, page 390 to 396, quoting reports of the Ministry of Transport, 99% of London Underground workers struck. On the Great Western Railway by May 11th, only 8.4% of goods trains ran. On the London Midland Service, less than 3%, and on the London and North Eastern Railway, less than 1%. Railwaymen claim that these figures were exaggerated by running the trains over much shorter distances and so increasing the number of trains, but not the goods carried. The reply of the government was to increase the terror. The limits of their own laws were too narrow for them. Thrusting aside the Constitution and laws, the Cabinet, no doubt with memories of their black and tans, promised immunity to the forces for any violence they might wish to commit. On May 7th, they broadcast this announcement. All ranks of the armed forces of the Crown are hereby notified that any action which they may find it necessary to take in an honest endeavour to aid the civil power will receive, both now and afterwards, the full support of His Majesty's government. Nevertheless, the armed forces were little used other than as a threatening parade. The chief forces of the government were the regular police, the special constabulary, and an extra special body of mounted specials recruited from the well-to-do to form Cossack troops. Their chief weapons were wholesale arrests, where the strikers were not too strong, and wild baton charges, often on crowds coming out of theatres and cinemas. But the strikers stood firm. The two classes confronted one another as over a barricade. As the strike developed, some members of the ruling class, particularly those running municipalities, showed signs of worry. The Newcastle City Council, with a heavy Conservative majority, called upon the government to seek an armistice. The Archbishop of Canterbury, after consulting the leaders of the churches, appealed for the calling off of the strike, the withdrawal of the miners' lockout, and the renewal of the coal subsidy until a settlement was found. The anxiety was not limited to city councillors and parsons. J. H. Thomas, representing the railwaymen, found early in the strike that his duties took him to Buckingham Palace. King George asked him a number of questions, and expressed his sympathy for the miners. At the end of the talk, His Majesty, who was gravely disturbed, remarked, "It is said, well, Thomas, if the worst happens, I suppose all this," with a gesture indicating his surroundings, "will vanish." Fortunately for Britain and the world, it did not come to the worst. The trade unions saw to that. Memoirs Kleins. 30 pieces. But the government was undisturbed. It knew its agents in the trade union movement. All during the strike, the General Council was seeking anything which looked like a way out. In the course of their seeking, they met Sir A. Bailey and Sir Herbert Samuel at the former's house. Samuel proposed terms of settlement which included wage cuts and some vague reorganization of the mining industry. That was sufficient for the General Council, who pretended that the proposals were somehow coming from the government. Sir Herbert Samuel was quite clear about this, saying, "I have been acting entirely on my own initiative, have received no authority from the government, and can give no assurances on their behalf." The government, through the Ministry of Labour, Sir Arthur Steele Maitland, declared that no terms would be considered or negotiations opened. The strikers must surrender unconditionally. Returning to the miners' leaders, the General Council presented these unofficial and private conversations as terms of settlement, speaking airily of guarantees. Mr. Pugh was continually pressed and questioned by Mr. Smith, the MFGB president, myself and my colleagues as to what the guarantees mentioned were, and who had given them. We got no answer. A.J. Cook, The 9 Days. The miners' leaders contemptuously rejected the shufflings of the General Council and expressed their determination to carry on the fight. The Council deputation then went to 10 Downing Street, and Pugh, addressing Baldwin, said, "We are here today, sir, to say that this general strike is to be terminated forthwith in order that negotiations may proceed." Wednesday, May 12, 1926. Once again, workers looked at one another with bitter eyes and said, "We are betrayed." Immediately, the police terror was renewed. The number of arrests increased after the strike, and baton charges continued. On the night of Wednesday, May 12th, a meeting of dockers was being held outside Poplar Town Hall when a lorry full of police drove through the crowd, scattering injured people to each side. Father Grosser, the vicar, held up a crucifix and told the police the meeting was peaceful. He too was batoned. The same night, a van load of police was driven to the headquarters of the Poplar branch of the National Union of Railwaymen. Without warning, the police charged into the building and batoned all within reach. When the strikers returned to their places of work the following day, hundreds of thousands of them were met by victimization, demands for non-unionism, wage reductions, or dismissals. The railwaymen were the chief victims and spontaneously renewed the strike. The threat of a new general strike without the leaders curbed the viciousness of the employers' attack. Yet, even then, thousands of men were victimized. In sullen anger, the workers returned, and the miners were left to fight alone until November, when, driven by hunger, they accepted defeat. Wages were cut, the working day was increased from 7 to 8 hours, and district agreements replaced the national agreement. Post-mortem. It is now our task to examine the various social bodies and forces at work in the strike, and from a study of their relationship, find lessons valuable to the workers in their struggle against the employing class. The government and the employers. The old revolutionary statement that the state is but the executive committee of the ruling class was well justified by the events of 1926. From the beginning to the end of the struggle, the Constitution was on the side of the mine owners. All the old social democratic nonsense of the state being above the classes was cruelly pushed to one side by the employers and their government. Although the Conservative Party was in power, the Liberal Party was wholeheartedly behind the coal owners. In times of strike, the Popular Front sham of progressive liberalism is flung aside, and the Liberal coal owner is at one with his Tory brother. The Popular Front can wait until the next general election. A fairly large fascist movement existed in 1926 in the form of the British Fascisti. Forgotten were the social message and workers' charter of fascism. The fascists joined the OMS and drove lorries or unloaded ships, as did the other blacklegs. The role of the leaders of the TUC and the Labour Party was particularly despicable, for they had always been opposed to the general strike, and never at any time had they withdrawn their opposition to it. By leading a struggle they opposed, they took the part of the agent provocateurs. It seems that the Labour leaders believed that a struggle in defence of the miners was inevitable, and that it was better to initiate the fight in order to control and hamstring it. In any case, what treachery lacked, cowardice made up. It must not be forgotten that apart from the rights and wrongs of calling a general strike, there would, in any case, with the miners' lockout, have been widespread unofficial fighting in all parts of the country. which would have produced anarchy in the movement. Ernest Bevin in The Record. What I dreaded about this strike more than anything else was this: if by any chance it should have got out of the hands of those who had been able to exercise some control, every sane man knows what would have happened. I thank God it never did. J. H. Thomas in the House of Commons, May 13, 1926. Every day that the strike proceeded, the control and the authority of that dispute was passing out of the hands of responsible executives into the hands of men who had no authority, no control, and was wrecking the movement. Charles Duke, NUG and MW, Report 1927, Conference of Executives. I have never disguised that in a challenge to the Constitution, God help us unless the Constitution won. J. H. Thomas, House of Commons, May 3, 1926. I have never favoured the principle of a general strike. J. H. Thomas at Hammersmith, May 9, 1926. No general strike was ever planned or seriously contemplated as an act of trade union policy. I told my own union in April that such a strike would be a national disaster. We were against the stoppage, not in favour of it. Memoirs Kleins. The Independent Labour Party was at that time anything but independent, and was still affiliated to the Labour Party, a majority of Labour members of Parliament and ex-cabinet ministers being members of the ILP. The attitude of the ILP was essentially that of the Labour Party. Its leaders, Snowden and MacDonald, had years before opposed the general strike in their long disputes with the syndicalists. In 1926, MacDonald was still leader of the ILP, as well as the Labour Party, and was still repeating his old opposition to the general strike. I don't like general strikes. I am terribly cold-blooded about the matter. With the discussion of general strikes and Bolshevism and all that sort of thing, I have nothing to do at all. Ramsay MacDonald, House of Commons, May 3, 1926. The Communist Party had never yet aspired to be anything more than the vague left wing of the Labour Party and trade unions. The crisis of 1925 and 1926 found them without any alternative policy to that of the Labour leaders. On the second day of the strike, the Communist Party issued a manifesto repeating the MFGB slogan, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day," and adding a self-contradictory call to nationalise the mines under workers' control without compensation, and the formalisation of a Labour government, that is a government of MacDonald, Snowden, Kleins and Thomas. The miners must wait until the next general election for that. To these slogans the Communist Party added the one it had used since the beginning of the crisis: all power to the General Council, a stupid parody of the slogan of the October Revolution, all power to the Soviets. All power to Thomas, Kleins and Bevin. They already had too much power, the power to betray the miners. There existed at this time a trade union opposition known as the Minority Movement, a thinly disguised communist body. Shortly before the strike, in the usual communist fashion, it claimed to have an affiliated membership of 1 million. Being a communist organisation, it was forced to trail behind the CP, and during the strike, in which it played no part, it even ceased to hold meetings. A few years later, it perished miserably. We shall rise again. No syndicalist movement existed in Britain in 1926, although until the end of the Great War, a small propaganda movement had lived vigorously. Unfortunately, this movement had been eclipsed by the Russian Revolution or engulfed by trade union work. Nevertheless, the general strike propaganda of the old syndicalist group had had a much greater effect than was ever expected of it. The idea of the general strike appealed to the imagination and conscience of the British worker. The present syndicalist movement in England was as yet unborn in 1926. The betrayals of a decade, the failure of 2 Labour governments, the Labour desertion of the Spanish Revolution and the socialist-communist support of the Second World War were to later make inevitable the creation of our present revolutionary movement. Without a syndicalist minority among the miners, factory workers and transport men on the picket lines and at the local strike headquarters, the strikers were easy prey to the Judas Iscariots. Without such a strong, compact and resolute body of conscious revolutionaries, no alternative to treacherous leadership could be found. Of the workers, nothing but the highest praise is sufficient. They responded to the strike call magnificently. When the government wished to publish the British Gazette, not one linotype operator could be found to set up its paper. In thousands of cases, trade unionists walked out to certain dismissal. In many cases, especially on the railway, men in supervisory posts sacrificed jobs and pensions to join the fight. The 9th day of the strike found the workers more determined than ever to carry on the fight. There was never any drift back. What the workers lacked was revolutionary understanding and organization. It is our task to create these. The general strike is not dead. Weighing carefully the treachery and cowardice of labour leaders and drawing inspiration from the courage and sacrifice of the workers, we prepare ourselves for the second British general strike.